The first Formula 1 car built by Jordan Grand Prix, the Gary Anderson designed 191 would give the sport's first and so far only Irish team its debut. Powered by a 3.5 litre Ford HbA4 V8 engine, the Jordan 191 was little more than a midfielder during the team's first season of competition. But considering that this was a brand new team, that was still an impressive achievement, and the car would go on to score 13 points across the 1991 season, with all of those points being scored across a 5-race streak from the Canadian to the German Grand Prix. Its best finish being 2 fourth places at the hands of experienced driver Andrea De Cesaris. In 1991, 13 points for a brand new team was a respectable result, and the team would end up finishing 5th in the Constructors' Championship. A very good debut result. Whilst all the team's points would be scored in that span of 5 races, the car's most memorable moment would come after that streak had ended at the Belgian Grand Prix. The moment that this car became inextricably linked with that of a certain German driver. Following the Hungarian Grand Prix, the team's second driver, Bertrand Gachot, would be arrested after he attacked a London taxi driver with tear gas, curtailing his season and leaving the team in a bit of a pickle. They needed a second driver, and fast. That's when decorated and skilled sports car driver Michael Schumacher was recommended to the team, and they snapped him up. And he went on to impress immediately. During the qualifying session of the Belgian Grand Prix, he managed to qualify 7th. Out-qualifying his more experienced teammate De Cesaris, who would only start in 11th. His race, however, would last less than a mile, as his clutch would give out at Eau Rouge on the very first lap of the Grand Prix. And once he got out of that car, he never got back into a Jordan again, as he had done enough to impress the other teams, and he would be snapped up by Benetton. Schumacher was in turn replaced by Roberto Moreno and then Alessandro Zanardi, but the 191 had scored its final points already. Jordan continued competing into the 1990s, mainly as a midfield team that was occasionally picking up podiums. In 1998, the team would finally pick up its first ever race victory at the chaotic Belgian Grand Prix, and in 1999 the team even had a distant shout of fighting for the title, but it was not to be. Driven by Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Jarno Trulli for the 2001 season, the Jordan EJ11 brought the team Works Honda engines to try and improve from what was considered a disappointing 2000 season, where the team had only finished 6th in the Constructors' Championship. The EJ11 would be the last of the Jordans to use an animal motif on the nose, starting in 1997 with a snake dubbed Hissing Sid, then a hornet from 1999 to 2000, and finally the shark motif of the EJ11. But whilst the car felt as fast and ferocious as a shark during pre-season testing, it ended up being about as lazy and aloof as Ellen Jo the Shark Girl instead during the races. As such, the EJ11 would be the first Jordan since 1996 to fail to score a podium, something that even the so-called lackluster 2000 car had managed to achieve. The car's poor performance would lead to the team having a tumultuous season, and following a string of poor performances and disagreements with the team's founder Eddie Jordan, Frentzen would depart the team for Prost, performing a straight swap with Jean Alesi, who would replace him. Alesi could only manage to score a single point for the team with a 6th place finish at the Belgian Grand Prix, by which point the car's performance and reliability had dropped off a cliff. Come the season finale at the Japanese Grand Prix, the team was just 2 points behind Sauber in 4th place at the Constructors' Championship, and they needed a good result, but they wouldn't get it. Alesi would collide with Raikkonen during the Grand Prix, and Trulli simply wasn't on the pace, meaning that the team would finish 5th for the 5th time in their history, with 19 points, a far cry from the 3rd place finish they achieved in 1999. They would never finish 5th again. The team's downward trajectory had begun, and they were transitioning into backmarkers. They would only achieve 2 more podiums, a shock victory at the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix, and a 3rd place finish at the controversial 2005 United States Grand Prix, where only 6 cars competed. By that point, Jordan had already been purchased by the Midland Group, and 2005 would be the last season that the Jordan name was on the grid. The team would spend 2 years as Midland and then Spiker, and then the team would be purchased by Indian businessman Vijay Mallya to become Force India. Debuting in the 2010 Formula 1 season, the Force India VJM03, driven by Adrian Sutil and Vincentonio Liuzzi, would make significant progress over its predecessor, the VJM02, which, although being a backmarker car for the majority of the 2009 season, had managed to achieve the team's unexpected first pole position and podium. The VJM03 would not achieve either across its competitive career, but it was far more consistent when scoring points, and as such it would achieve 68 points across the 2010 season, enough to finish 7th in the Constructors' Championship that year. The first half of the year would be fairly strong for Force India, as that both cars would score multiple times before the summer break. However, following the summer break, the car was outdeveloped by its rivals and points became harder to come by. The best results that the car managed to achieve were 2 5th places at the hands of Sutil, whilst Liuzzi could only manage a single 6th place at the Korean Grand Prix. This would end up being Liuzzi's best season in Formula 1, as the following year he would go to backmarkers HRT. It may not have been the greatest car on the grid, but it propelled the team back into the midfield for the first time since the Jordan days, re-establishing them here for years to come. In 2011, Force India finally had the opportunity to race in their home country for the first time. The team would enter the VJM04, piloted again by Adrian Sutil and Paul di Resta, replacing Vincentonio Liuzzi. The season would not start well for Force India. The car was off the pace by quite a lot, resulting in Paul di Resta failing to score in 8 of the first 10 rounds. Sutil, on the other hand, would start scoring consistently from the Monaco Grand Prix onwards, typically scoring every other round, scoring the car's best finish of 6th place twice. De Resta would start scoring again from the Hungarian Grand Prix onwards, scoring 6th place as well at the Singapore Grand Prix. With the car's pace getting better as the season went on, the team found themselves fighting for 5th place in the Constructors' Championship, for the first time as Force India. But ultimately, they would fall short by just 4 points, finishing the season with 69 points in 6th place in the Constructors' Championship. "2012 would end up being a very competitive year for Force India, as it would be for pretty much every other team on the grid that season. Whilst they wouldn't go on to score any podiums, they would score very strongly across the 20-race season. Their challenger that year, the VJM-05, would once again be driven by Paul de Resta, and Nico Hülkenberg would replace Adrian Sutil after the latter was convicted of assault. The VJM-05 would end up scoring fairly frequently, but it was still inconsistent in terms of its pace. At times it could be the 3rd fastest car on the grid, at others it was just barely scraping into the points. But it was firmly a midfield car, as it would typically score in the lower half of the top 10, although it would manage to score a couple of 4th place finishes. However, the team nearly ended the season with a race victory at the season finale in Brazil. Nico Hülkenberg actually ended up leading the race for 10 laps towards the end, and he looked set to take his and Force India's first ever Grand Prix victory. However, his efforts came to nothing on lap 54 when he lost control and slid into the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton, breaking the Brit's suspension and earning himself a drive-through penalty, which ultimately dropped him down to 5th at the flag. The VJM-05 would prove to be the most successful Force India yet, and one of the most reliable, as it would have very few mechanical retirements. The team would finish the season with 109 points, the first time that the outfit had managed to achieve this many points since the team's inception. But due to how competitive the field was that season, Force India would only end up finishing 7th overall in the Constructors' Championship, meaning they would earn less prize money for scoring more points than they did in the previous season. It seems kinda counterintuitive, really. Adrian Sutil returned to Force India for the 2013 season to pilot the VJM-06 alongside Paul de Resta, whilst Nico Hülkenberg went gallivanting off to Sauber for one season. The VJM-06 would prove to be a thoroughly unremarkable racing car. Even though it had a solid start to the season, it all fell apart when the car's pace dropped off dramatically following the British Grand Prix, around the same time that the tyres got changed, after several of them dramatically disintegrated during that race. Points would seldom come after that, though they would manage to score a double points finish at their home race in India, the only time they managed to achieve that whilst that Grand Prix was on the calendar. The car's best result would be a 4th place at the hands of De Resta at the Bahrain Grand Prix, whilst 2 rounds later, Sutil managed his best result of the season with 5th place in Monaco. Sutil's form was lackluster, the year away from the sport doing no good for his form, and by the end of the season he would be dropped by Force India to go to Sauber instead, performing a straight swap with Nico Hülkenberg. It wasn't just Sutil's days that were numbered, however. Paul de Resta would also end up being dropped by the team by the end of the season, and his last Grand Prix as a full-time Formula 1 driver would be the 2013 finale in Brazil. After this, he would go on to be a pundit at Sky Sports, though he would make a one-off appearance as a reserve driver for Williams in 2017. Force India would go on to score 77 points across the 2013 season, enough to finish a distant 6th place in the Constructors' Championship, 20 points ahead of 7th placed Sauber, but almost 50 behind 5th placed McLaren. For 2014, Sergio Perez would partner with the returning Nico Hülkenberg to drive the new turbo-powered VJM 07. The team's season would get off to a decent start, with a double points finish at the season opener in Australia, but then just 2 rounds later, the team would take home their largest single points haul in their history at the Bahrain Grand Prix, when Perez would finish on the podium in 3rd place, with Hülkenberg bringing up the rear in 5th. This was Perez's first podium since 2012 when he was with Sauber, and the team's first podium since 2009. It would be the high point of the team's season, as the team would not score another podium for the rest of the year, and Perez would not finish any higher than 6th for the remaining Grand Prix. But that didn't stop the car from being competitive, owing in large part to its very strong Mercedes power unit, and the car would seldom finish outside of the points. The team would be embroiled in a season-long battle for 5th place in the Constructors' Championship with McLaren, though ultimately they fell a little bit short. The team would finish the season with 155 points to their name, finishing 6th in the Constructors for the 2nd year in a row. It wouldn't be a flawless season by any means, however. The team would fail to score on 2 occasions, owing to double DNFs, and a potential 2nd podium of the season fell through after Perez collided with the Williams of Felipe Massa at the Canadian Grand Prix. The car's reliability was also rock solid, as only 2 of the car's retirements came at the hands of mechanical failures. All of the rest were crashes. With the dominant Mercedes power unit in the back of the car, Force India was starting to gain a bit of a reputation as a team that was able to punch above its weight, as it would operate on a shoestring budget, yet was always able to produce a strong performing car. But this shoestring budget was due to one very important reason. The team's owner, Vijay Mallya, was starting to be under a little bit of financial pressure due to a whole bunch of controversies that I won't go into here. It's a whole story in of itself, but that shoestring budget would eventually come back to bite Force India in the arse. Just not yet. Force India suffered a disastrous pre-season in 2015, as they were delayed in deploying the new VJM-08 when they switched to the Toyota wind tunnel in Cologne. Therefore, the A-spec variant of the VJM-08 would only turn up at the third pre-season test, with the team forced to run the older VJM-07 for the first two tests. This delay impacted the performance of the VJM-08, and the first half of the team's season would be impacted quite heavily, the car seldom scoring points. The car was clearly quite a handful in the hands of Perez and Hulkenberg, and they struggled to get the car into the points, that is until the B-spec variant of the car arrived at the British Grand Prix, and the team's season was completely transformed. After only scoring in 5 of the first 8 races, the team would then go on to score in all but 1 of the remaining 11, with the highlight of the team's season coming at the Russian Grand Prix, when Perez would be fortunate enough to pick up a third place podium after the Ferrari of Raikkonen and the Williams of Bottas came together in the closing laps. The team would go on to finish the season with 136 points, enough to finish 5th place in the Constructors' Championship, one higher than last year owing to the entire McLaren-Honda saga. The team might have even been able to challenge for 4th had the first half of the season gone better, though in the end the VJM-08 was probably not the most consistent or high-performing car to be able to achieve that. Regardless of this, the team's performances were starting to improve, and it looked like the team was on the up and up. And indeed they were. The Force India VJM-09 may have looked a lot like the VJM-08, its direct predecessor, but its performances were much improved. Whilst the first few races of the season would not be particularly great, only scoring 14 points in the first 5 rounds, the team's season would truly begin in sensational style at the Monaco Grand Prix, with Hulkenberg managing to pick up 6th on the final lap, and Perez finishing a sensational 3rd. Then, just 2 rounds later, Perez would stand on the podium yet again, giving the Force India team their first and only season where they scored more than 1 podium in a season. From the Monaco Grand Prix onwards, Force India would go on to score in all but one of the remaining races, with the only blip being the Austrian Grand Prix. They would also go on to score double points finishes on all but 3 occasions, aside from Austria. And this stellar finishing record meant that the team would overtake a struggling Williams for 4th place in the Constructors' Championship, the position they would eventually finish in with 173 points, their best season up to that point. Even better than their 2014 season. Force India were now best of the rest and the star of the midfield. They were the head of Formula 1.5. It was truly remarkable what the team could do on such a small budget, but that budget was starting to get even smaller. For Vijay Mallya's issues were starting to become paramount. It was around this time that the Indian businessman would come to the UK and then just never leave, owing to an extradition order in his home country. That order has yet to be exercised, but still, Mallya's influence within the team was starting to wane, and financial troubles would start to creep into the team, despite good performances like this. After initially running in the old silver livery in the 2017 pre-season, Force India took on a new visual identity when they took on sponsorship from BWT and a new pink livery, something I hated at the time and has somewhat grown on me, if I'm honest, though I prefer the later liveries. The VJM10 would be driven once again by Sergio Perez, but Nico Hülkenberg would depart for Renault, and he would be replaced by Mercedes junior driver Esteban Ocon. Together, the two drivers would turn the VJM10 into an incredibly consistent point scorer, and the car would score points in all but one Grand Prix that season, Monaco. The car would have just 3 retirements all season, but 2 of those came at the hands of the drivers themselves, clashing at the Azerbaijan and Belgian Grand Prix and causing terminal damage for Perez's car on both occasions. The car would also fail to stand on the podium, with the best result being a 4th place at the Spanish Grand Prix. This made it the first Force India to fail to stand on the podium since 2013, but it wasn't all bad. With the car scoring points in all but one Grand Prix that season, it was more than enough for the team to finish 4th for the 2nd year in a row, with even more points than 2016, 187, the best performance that Force India ever had. This was 104 points more than 5th placed Williams, the Grove-based outfit now struggling a lot compared to their rivals, and Force India was now definitely the team to beat in the midfield. But with Vijay Mallya now a wanted man in India, his supply of cash to the team was now beginning to dry up, and the team would soon start to feel the pinch. Quite literally. It wasn't obvious yet, but the end was nigh for Force India, and 2017 would be the last full season that the team would exist in this form. Force India entered the VJM11 into the 2018 Formula 1 season, and they would retain drivers Sergio Perez and Esteban Ocon, for a season that would end up being rather tumultuous for the Silverstone-based outfit. The season would not start well for the team, as it would score just 1 point from the first 3 rounds. But then the season got going properly at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, when Perez was able to pick up a 3rd place podium, courtesy of the Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel suffering from some issues at the safety car restart, and the Mercedes of Bottas suffering a late race puncture. Little did anyone know at the time that this podium would be the last achieved by Force India. The car was much more inconsistent than either of its predecessors, as it would rarely trouble the top 5. The pace of the car, however, was far from being at the top of Force India's worries that season, as the team's financial troubles finally caught up to them mid-season, and the team went bankrupt following the Hungarian Grand Prix. With the team entered into administration, all of the team's assets were purchased by a conglomerate led by Canadian businessman Lawrence Stroll. But whilst they could buy everything that the team owned, the one thing that they couldn't manage to transfer was the team's original entry from 1991 when they were Jordan, and thus the team was forced to start from scratch at the Belgian Grand Prix, essentially being recognised as an entirely brand new team with no points on the table, and the original Force India entry was excluded. This new team would take on the name Racing Point Force India, as this was the Racing Point team running Force India chassis, technically in a customer relationship. This new entity would go on to score 52 points in the remaining 9 rounds of the season, a respectable effort that earned them 7th place in the Constructors' Championship. This would have been 111 points and 5th had the team been able to retain the 59 points scored whilst it was still Sahara Force India. It should be noted that one of the key figures who saved the team was Sergio Perez. If not for his efforts, the team would have collapsed mid-season and we would have only had 18 cars on the grid. Force India was dead, but a phoenix rose from the ashes and took on the name Racing Point in 2019. Sergio Perez would be retained by this new outfit, and Esteban Ocon would be unceremoniously dumped in favour of Lawrence Stroll's son, Lance Stroll. This could possibly go wrong, could it? Team nepotism had quite the struggle ahead of them. The new RP19 was not exactly a spring chicken, and it struggled to score points regularly. The car was essentially a haphazard evolution of the VJM11, and as such it lacked consistency and pace, at least for the first half of the season. A major upgrade at the Belgian Grand Prix saw the car receive a more conventional style nose, and the car's aerodynamics became much improved, allowing it to finish in the points in 8 of the 9 Grand Prix following the summer break. At least in the hands of Perez. Perez was by far the more consistent point scorer, achieving a best finish of 6th place twice. But it would be his teammate Stroll who would pick up the car's best finish at the chaotic German Grand Prix, P4, a respectable result that could have potentially been a podium if not for the recovering Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel. This was also Stroll's best finish of his season, as he would only score a P9 or 10 on the other 5 occasions that he finished in the points. Still, that 4th place contributed a significant portion of the team's points haul that season, and they would go on to score 73 points over the 21 races of that year, finishing 7th place in the Constructors' Championship for the 2nd year in a row, technically. The team was just 18 points behind 5th placed Renault, and one wonders what might have happened had they still had Ocon in the car instead of Stroll. Regardless, this was the hand that they were dealt, and the team had some rather sneaky plans for the 2020 season, what was scheduled to be the last season of the 2017 aero regulations. When Racing Point unveiled the RP20 at 2020 pre-season testing in Barcelona, they immediately came under intense scrutiny, because the RP20 had a rather suspicious resemblance to the previous year's championship-winning Mercedes W10, to the point that if you put the two cars side by side, you'd have trouble telling them apart, aside from the different colour schemes. This resemblance earned the team the nicknames Pink Mercedes and Tracing Point, nicknames that were rather apt because the team was found to have copied the rear brake ducts from the Mercedes a little too closely, to the point that they had 15 points deducted from their total. Despite protests from various other teams, the car was allowed to compete relatively unchanged for the shortened season, and it proved to be an incredibly good car. Maybe not as good as the W10, but still better than half the field. The car was generally the 3rd fastest overall, though it did receive a fair amount of competition from the McLaren MCL35, and the two teams would be locked in battle for 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship, a position that neither team would usually be in had Ferrari not been bumped down the order. Despite the car's inherent pace, it had a lot of hidden potential that never really seemed to be unlocked by Perez and Lance Stroll, and it could be somewhat inconsistent, as sometimes it was just barely scraping into the points. But in general, it was scoring in almost every single round, and at times the car's potential was properly realised. At the Turkish Grand Prix, Stroll did something that the Silverstone team hadn't been able to achieve since 1999, achieve a pole position, albeit more out of luck than judgment. And at the penultimate round of the season at the Sakir Grand Prix, Perez scored his first ever Grand Prix victory in the RP20, something the team hadn't managed to achieve since 2003, and something they haven't managed to achieve since. But despite the victory and 3 other podiums, Racing Point ultimately fell short and finished 4th in the Constructors' Championship, just 7 points behind McLaren. Without that 15-point penalty, they would have been 8 points ahead instead. Racing Point was rebranded as Aston Martin for 2021, and Sergio Perez was rewarded for saving the team from bankruptcy and providing the team's first win in 17 years by being replaced by 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel, whilst Lance Stroll continued to drive for Team Nepotism. Their steed for that season was the AMR 21, an evolution of the previous year's RP20, and it was hoped that the strong pace that the RP20 showed would carry over into 2021. This was not the case, as the 2021 regulations ended up damaging the performance of low-rake cars, of which the Aston Martin was one of them, and its performance went into a sharp decline. What had once been a rapid, high midfield car became an inconsistent mess that struggled for points all season long. Not even the seasoned hands of Vettel could do much with it. Despite the car's poor performance, Sebastian Vettel did manage to wrangle an unlikely podium out of the car at the chaotic Azerbaijan Grand Prix, scoring second place behind Sergio Perez, giving the Aston Martin brand its first official podium in an F1 Grand Prix. A second podium was on the cards at the even more chaotic Hungarian Grand Prix, and Vettel did finish second place on the road on that occasion, but he was then disqualified for having less than a litre of fuel left in the car. These otherwise excellent performances didn't make the car any faster, however, and the Aston Martin continued to struggle for the rest of the season, rarely getting into the points. Its best result outside of the podium was Vettel's 5th place at Monaco, whilst the best result that Stroll could achieve was 6th in Qatar. The team ended up scoring just 77 points across 2021, enough for just 7th place in the Constructors' Championship, a far cry from the nearly 3rd place finish of the previous year. The team clearly had a lot of work to do for the new regulations in 2022, but with Sebastian Vettel on board, surely he would help the team develop a rapid car. The Aston Martin AMR 22 was anything but rapid. In fact, the team started the season with completely the wrong aero concept. The bulbous sides looked promising and were quite radical, but they were anything but fast, and the resulting car was slow, heavy, and incapable of scoring points in the first 3 rounds of the season. After the car finally scored its first points at the 4th round in Imola, the team would bring a rather familiar looking upgrade at the Spanish Grand Prix, bringing back the allegations of Tracing Point, or rather Green Red Bull, as the upgrade looked very similar to the then pace-setting Red Bull RB18. However, you can copy an aero concept, but without an understanding of it, you're not exactly going to go particularly quickly, and the Aston Martin's pace did improve, but it wasn't a rocket ship. The Red Bull-esque upgrade did not bring Red Bull pace, and the car continued to be slow and inconsistent for the remainder of the season, never finishing higher than 6th place. A disillusioned Sebastian Vettel would call it quits following the Hungarian Grand Prix, making 2022 the final season of his career, and the first in his career since 2007, where he wouldn't stand on the podium even once. Vettel would eventually get to grips with the car somewhat, and would start dragging it into the points more often as the season drew to its end, but it wouldn't be enough to provide the team any higher than 55 points and 7th in the Constructors' Championship again. tied on points with Alfa Romeo for 6th, but finishing 7th due to the fact that their best race result was 6th, whilst Alfa Romeo's was 5th. Whilst Vettel was leaving the team, Fernando Alonso saw a lot of promise in it instead, and the day after Vettel announced his retirement from the sport, Alonso announced his switch from Alpine to Aston Martin, setting in motion the whole Alpine kerfuffle thingamajig. But given the team's performance for the previous 2 seasons, a lot of people doubted that it was going to go well for Alonso at all. The Aston Martin AMR23 had a very promising pre-season test in Bahrain, finishing with the 2nd fastest time overall. Then, at the Bahrain Grand Prix, Fernando Alonso qualified a respectable, if somewhat disappointing, 5th place. But in the race itself, that became a podium finish, after Alonso overtook Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc suffered an engine failure. With Lance Stroll bringing up the rear in 6th place, it was a very strong beginning to the season for Aston Martin, and the season would only get better. Alonso would go on to finish on the podium 8 times across the season, including 3 second place finishes in Monaco, Canada and the Netherlands, though that Monaco podium arguably should have been a Grand Prix victory had the team not dropped the ball in the strategy department. The AMR23 was pretty much the 2nd fastest car for much of the first half of the season, and it could have easily won a race had this not been 2023 and the season where Red Bull nailed the regulations so thoroughly that nobody else could catch them. The team was 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship until they were overtaken by Mercedes at the Spanish Grand Prix. They could have stayed in 2nd had the upgrades they introduced performed as expected, causing the car's performance to drop off instead of increase. Following the 2nd place in Canada, Alonso would stand on the podium just 2 more times. The 2nd place at the Netherlands, and the nail-biting 3rd place photo finish at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. But these podiums were not enough to keep the team elevated in the Constructors' Championship. After Mercedes overtook them, Ferrari were not far behind, and then McLaren of all teams came along and overtook them as well, after the Woking outfit had started the season as the slowest car on average, and ultimately the team would finish the season 5th place in the Constructors' Championship with 280 points. A respectable number of points and a season to build on, but ultimately Aston Martin would not be able to replicate this level of success, and the team began a downward spiral. 2023 could have been the best season the Silverstone team ever had, but instead it turned into a tale of wasted potential. The Aston Martin AMR24 began the season in much the same way that the AMR23 ended the season, in a confused and inconsistent place. At the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix, Alonso said over the radio that this was a lovely car to drive. At the same Grand Prix 1 year later, He couldn't believe how bad it was. Alonso would score points in the first 6 rounds, including the car's single best finish of a 5th place in Saudi Arabia, but after that, points became much harder to come by. And if Alonso was struggling, Stroll was having an absolute horrendous time. Stroll would only score points 6 times across the entire season, and all of these points came before the summer break. After the Hungarian Grand Prix, he wouldn't score again, and his pace was rock bottom. It was as if his joy and love for the sport had completely evaporated, to the point that he would make embarrassing errors, such as spinning out of the formation lap of the Sao Paulo Grand Prix and then driving into the gravel, as if he didn't expect his car to get beached, which is what ultimately ended up happening. He also earned himself a bit of an unwelcome record of the most Q1 exits in a single season, or something like that. He just wasn't qualifying well at all. Alonso would consistently get onto the radio and complain about the car, whilst Stroll was out there embarrassing himself. And all this can be put squarely on the forehead of the many botched upgrades that the car received. It seemed as though Aston Martin just couldn't get a handle on their upgrades. They had some of the best and newest facilities in the sport and the highest budget, and they could only produce crap. But at this point it didn't really matter how well the team scored in 2024 or 2025, because their strategy was to put all of their chips on 2026. The team was already hiring for that year. They were going to snatch Adrian Newey from Red Bull and procure the Honda engines from Red Bull as well. 2026 was looking good at this point, so it didn't matter that they finished 2024 in 5th place with 94 points. And so we reach 2025, the most recent season as of recording, and it would be Aston Martin's worst season since 2022. The team would only end up scoring 89 points across the 24 races, enough for a lowly 7th place in the Constructors' Championship, not helped by the fact that Alonso failed to score for the first 8 rounds of the season. And yet he would still end up outscoring Lance Stroll, who didn't score from rounds 3 to 11, and then rounds 16 to 23. 2 streaks of 9 and 8 races where Stroll didn't score a single point. And all this was happening whilst fellow customer Mercedes team McLaren was leading the Constructors' Championship and winning it all for the 2nd year in a row. And other fellow customer Mercedes teams, Williams, were having their best season in a decade, even scoring 2 podiums, which Aston Martin hadn't achieved since 2023, and probably still won't be achieving for at least another year. But that didn't matter. It didn't matter how much Alonso was complaining over the radio. 2025 was just a year that the team could write off. Adrian Newey had been successfully hired from Red Bull, but he would not be doing any work on the 2025 car. Instead, all of his efforts would go into designing the 2026 car, the AMR 26, which has been revealed by the time of recording, and it looks fairly radical. Adrian Newey certainly worked his magic before he was promoted to becoming the team's principal for some reason. But hey, at least he can still work on the car, right? And he's gonna need it, because the new Honda engine hasn't been produced by the same team that produced the Honda engines for Red Bull these past few years, and it's crap. They've had the worst pre-season in living memory since Williams 2019, and it's looking like everything's going completely wrong for the team, so that's great. In the immortal words of Niki Lauda from the movie Rush,
"It's amazing, all these facilities and you make a piece of crap like this."
There's one venture that Aston Martin started in 2025 that I feel is a lot more promising than their F1 ventures at the minute. Aston Martin joined the World Endurance Championship and the IMSA Sports Car Championship with the Aston Martin Valkyrie LMH, a 6.5 litre V12 powered hypercar prototype that aims to bring Aston Martin a 24 Hours of Le Mans win, if things can go well. It started both seasons looking pretty slow, but then things got better as time went on, scoring regular points in the World Endurance Championship and even managing to score a podium at the final race of the IMSA season at the Petit Le Mans at Road Atlanta. Its 2026 campaign has not started particularly well, with a poor result at the 24 Hours of Daytona, but here's hoping that Aston Martin can get this sonorous war machine to winning ways in no time at all. But we'll see. It's Aston Martin. Anything can happen. At least the Valkyrie is able to finish races, something I don't think we can say about the AMR 26 at the minute.